Delighted to welcome Professor Rajeswari Sunder, the name most of you might have already heard of. She is Global Distinguished Professor of English at New York University. She's worked extensively on issues of feminism and the state and literary analyses. She published books, The Scandal of the State and Clear and Imagined Women, numerous edited volumes, influential articles in various journals. Our talk today is titled Postcolonial Relations, Gandhi, Nehru, and the Ethical Imperatives of the National Popular. Without further ado, I invite Professor Rajeswari Sunder to talk. A small note, some of you here are in the Film Studies course. It starts at 4:15. So we have about 15 minutes. After the lecture, you're free to ask.
For 10 I've been warned that people have to leave. If you know from my other work, Rajan mentions my two books on feminist issues related to India. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. You know I work mostly in issues related to gender. And this particular paper is a departure from the work I had done earlier, in that it is not specifically focused on a gender-related issue, although it might be interesting to think whether, in fact, Gandhi's ethical practices and philosophy are in some way post-gender. So, although I haven't foregrounded that, it occurs to me that nothing really is ungendered. So we might, one of the things to think about would be whether there is a specific leaning towards a certain form of gendering in these practices that I discuss here, which relate to Gandhi's voluntary poverty. A couple of other things by way of preface to this discussion, which might be taking you away from other things that you have been studying and reading and so on. One is that there is a great deal of recent revived interest in Gandhi, and specifically in Gandhi as a philosopher. This is a particular term that was used by Akhil Bidrami in so many words, Gandhi as philosopher. So the idea of Gandhi as somewhat is work forming a kind of systematic body of thought that we might actually talk of a Gandhian philosophy. I think that is something that has interested people in political philosophy, in philosophy itself. So that's one trend of work. The other kind of interest in Gandhi really emerged from the subaltern historians who so there were many Gandhis. There was a way in which Gandhi was recuperated and understood by the peasantry. So a certain kind of interest in Gandhi came out of subaltern history. A certain kind of interest in Gandhi, I think, is emerging from philosophy, political philosophy, work by Akhil Bidrami, Rajeswari, Uday Mehta, Faisal Devji, and others. And of course, in Swaraj's 100th anniversary publication 2 years ago, saw a great many conferences, workshops, special issues of journals and so on, which revisited in Swaraj and began to look for its interesting positions. And of course, in India, Ashish Nandi has been somebody who, in a more culturalist vein and a more gendered idea of Gandhi's thinking and practices brought about a certain version of Gandhi. So a lot of this work is in a sort of ferment about thinking about Gandhi. My own work in this came as a very specific assignment. It's a conference that was held in Australia 2 years ago on the idea of imperial benevolence. And of course, the implicit assumption of that conference was that benevolence in the colonial context was a mask for forms of domination. And as it is in the present day world, forms of intervention on account of human rights or of aid from the West to developing countries. And all of this dissimulates and hides attempts to control and dictate. So this idea of benevolence was viewed with a great deal of suspicion. Announcements of the papers there were attempts to show how various projects of benevolence actually covered over less philanthropic ideas that lay at their basis. And I thought I wanted to break away from that endlessly suspicious notion of benevolence by asking whether Gandhi might represent somebody who did not fall into the trap of imperial benevolence, but at the same time wished in some ways to mark his identity, his marks, his partisanship with those who were poor, with those who didn't have anything. And so this came about as a result of having written that paper for that conference, specifically addressing the topic of benevolence. And eventually, and the way that papers do go through a number of changes, when it got reprinted in another collection, the emphasis became largely on the ethical aspects of what seemed like a lot of post-colonial and anti-colonial leaders were heavily invested in ethics as a particular kind of moral high ground that they could occupy in relation to those who colonized them. So it also became, and I'm not very comfortable with this, but it also became a kind of a strategic maneuver. To be ethical became, as it were, a clever move. It became a compensation for not having power. So ethics sort of balanced out against imperial power. So in some ways it gets, I think Gandhian ethics have tended to get recuperated in terms of anti-colonial strategy, both for mobilization of the people and as a way of asserting a certain kind of moral supremacy over the West. So I think that too is something these are things you might want to bear in mind when you ask yourself, why am I taking a paper on Gandhi on you? So this comes out of, as it were, a general climate of interest in Gandhi, a somewhat revisionary, serious and invested in Gandhian thought. So I begin by saying, therefore, as I already remarked, that for the leaders of many anti-colonial struggles, the ethical could become, and it often was developed, as an explicit agenda in the conduct of political life. It enabled colonized people to occupy the moral high ground of those who were injured. So righteousness functioned as a compensation for the lack of material power, allowing them to go beyond the abjectness of victims or the rage and ressentiment of the vanquished. So when anti-colonial struggles were launched, they threw up leaders marked by individual greatness. So it's not simply accidental, therefore, that the idea of the great figures of the 20th century are very often people like Gandhi, King, or Mandela, for whom greatness becomes, as it were, a consequence of such anti-colonial leadership. So many found the rhetoric of moral rightness as much as political right of strategic use in mass mobilization. I want to emphasize in this paper a related but different use of the ethical, which is directed not at the colonizer, but inwards, as a mode of self-fashioning that was both individual and communal. And I don't develop that here, but obviously when I say self-fashioning, the idea of an ethics of the self, or care of the self, it would remind you of Foucauldian, the late Foucauldian work on the care of the self and forms of fashioning of the self that happens as a deliberative process. In fact, there's some much to be gained by looking at Gandhi in terms of those ideas of Foucault's, which relate to the Stoics for the most part. So in struggles, but also in nation-building projects, the social and the national as forms of community had to be forged across existing. In other words, they didn't already exist, the nation didn't exist, society didn't exist. It had to be brought into being, it had to be brought into being across very vast divides of class, gender, caste, region, language, religion. In these enterprises, nationalist leaders had to be creative in finding ways to relate to the people that would avoid replicating not only colonial authoritarianism, but equally colonialist benevolence. Finding ways of being one with the people was not always easy, since relations of power have a tendency to assume similar forms across different contexts. The distance and divide between native elites and the masses, as much as between colonizer and colonizer, they're not just one divide between colonized, but also native elites who are leaders of the mass movements and the people, were reflected in the reformist drive, the pedagogical rhetoric, and the performance of sacrifice and service that often characterized the leadership exercised by the leaders. So the attempts to transcend the limits of such authoritarian benevolence led to what you see here is a self-conscious development, not something spontaneous. This is a kind of deliberative self-conscious development of an indigenous ethicality. To various degrees of success, I'm not just pushing for this as a kind of exemplary mode, but it's interesting to see what was attempted. The question of political ethics is therefore equally central to post-colonial politics and its forms and practices. Also, in this case, to the functioning and the function of democracy. In India, the morality of politics is identified with the names of the two most prominent nationalist leaders of the time, Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. The ethico-political mode of identification that I'm interested in exploring in the case of Gandhi will be directed chiefly at the idioms and practices of giving, insofar as it constitutes the basic structural and performative component of his adoption of voluntary poverty as a way of life, in the public eyes as much as within the intimate confines of family life. Gandhi's political morality and way of life is tautologically described, since it's so unique to him, sui generis. I mean, nobody else did what Gandhi did, so we call Gandhi a Gandhian. And that just doesn't take us very far, but you see what the point of that is. Gandhianism describes what Gandhi did. In the case of Nehru, my interest is in the ways he both exemplified and urged upon other Indians a relationship of intimacy and responsibility between nation and people, and among the people, for which the word patriotism will serve as shorthand. I invoke Gandhi at the origin of the concept of a specific technology of self that I named dissemination. Dissemination is the title also of Derrida's a book of Derrida, so this kind of strange bedfellows. I'm bringing Gandhi and Derrida together in particularly the notion of giving. And Nehru as the exemplification of a post-colonial national political leadership that resembles noblesse, oblige. I probably won't have the time to talk about Nehru at all, so this will have to suffice. The idea of noblesse oblige is a sort of anachronistic concept. It's Latin for nobility obliges. If you are a person of standing, a person, an elite person, you have a certain responsibility. What that consists of is generally marked in feudal relations, in relations of lord and serf. And the serf performs services to the lord, but the lord in return will take care, will adopt certain forms of responsibility towards those belonging. But that's something that I can't probably get into the time that we have. Gandhi's morality, I'll skip over some of this because you're very familiar with that. His morality was described by him as a series of experiments with truth. And it was a set of successive lifelong exercises, physical and spiritual. And first he performed them on himself, then he brought it, he persuaded his family and friends to follow that. And then sooner or later, he brought it to the attention of a larger public through his articles and speeches. And if he succeeded, he made it an exhortation, do as I do. If he failed, he made it a confession and said, well, see, I couldn't do it. And so these experiments with truth are, as I said, very much like the ethical habits cultivated by the philosophers in classical Greece and early Christian Rome that Foucault has resurrected for us under the descriptive term technologies of self. But the difference there being that Gandhi incorporated these ideas into an active political life. And they cohered into a single doctrine, which is satyagraha or soul force, which he put to use in the Indian freedom struggle and before that in South Africa. Voluntary poverty was central to achieving satyagraha, the first necessity for a life in politics in plain. Gandhi came late and by stages to the spectacular nakedness that made him the greatest exponent of voluntary poverty in the world. And this phrase is something he has attributed to himself. I mean, he called himself an exponent of voluntary poverty. We can follow these stages in his autobiography. In account of his student years in London, Gandhi describes this, and this is all done in a tone of comedy, and in his, how extravagant he was in his dress and social life, dressing, wearing formal clothes and going out to parties and ballroom dancing and so on. And then he began to check this as soon as he realized that his family, which was supporting him, could not afford to keep him in this style. So he makes changes in his life. He moves to cheaper rooms. He begins to walk instead of taking public transport. He cooks his own meals. And he expresses this with gusto as experiments in living. Let not the reader think, he says, that this living made my life by any means a dreary affair. On the contrary, the changes harmonized my inward and outward life, and my soul knew no bounds of joy. But as yet, at this stage, the simple life was dictated only by necessity and a principled wish to live within his means, not by what we would call the data ethics. It was later at the peak of his successful career as a barrister in South Africa in 1906 that he began to be, as he says, agitated by the need to find ways of, I quote, further simplifying my life, doing some concrete act of service to my fellow men. And then he began to, and you can see that doing the simple life and service to others go hand in hand. You can't have a simple life which by itself should simply seem eccentric and obsessive. And you cannot have service alone, which would be hypocritical if there was no simple life. So the two things had to go hand in hand, each legitimized and strengthen the ethical value of the other. And then the thought comes to him, and I'm quoting, that nothing less than giving up the desire for children and wealth and living the life of a vanaprastha, of one retired from household cares, was required of him if he was to devote himself completely to a life of public service. So that's the conclusion he comes to. But the first steps he takes in this are marked by dissatisfaction, filled with trial and error. He says initially he took to his house a leper. He kept him in his house, he washed his wounds and rested, he took care of him, and then he sends him off to the government hospital. He said, this is not what I want to do. I lack the will, he says, to keep him always with me. And this spiritual, Christian, symbolic mode of service was not quite what he wanted, not that singularity of contact with one-on-one, doing something for somebody in need. He wanted, as he said, some humanitarian work of a permanent nature and a larger field of operation in which he could perform this work. And for several years, from 1893 to 1906, he worked as a part-time medical dispenser. He volunteered his services as a stretcher bearer in the ambulance corps in the Boer War. He nursed wounded Zulus in the so-called Zulu rebellion. Many of these aspects of his life. And then he set up the Phoenix Ashram. The crucial thing here was his exposure to Ruskin's book, Unto This Last. It's almost like a religious conversion. This is how he talks about it. I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance with the ideals of the book. I arose with the dawn, ready to reduce these principles to practice. So the night he reads the book, in the morning he starts to practice the book. So principles and practice. And in the middle of his endeavors in the Zulu rebellion, he took his vow of brahmacharya or celibacy, which is the preliminary, as it were, to satyagraha. The remainder of his life in South Africa, which he left in 1915, was in the nature of an experiment using satyagraha as a political instrument. It was not to be primarily humanitarian, but broadly political. There's some kind of a distinction here, and don't want to get into it, but between the humanitarian and the political, I think Gandhi perceived both a distance and a closeness, a distinction between them, but that they had to be together. Now look at his practice and ideology of voluntary poverty and his doctrine of service separately. But this is a heuristic. I'm just separating them for analytic purposes. They actually go very close to each other. The logics were very combined and not free of contradictions. And I'm also going to highlight some of the difficulties of bringing these two together. I'll begin with an episode that he narrates in the autobiography, which will serve as a parable. Okay, a parable is a little illuminating story about the attitude to possessions that he had developed. And he's going to India by ship in 1914 in the company of a friend, a Phoenix ashram fellow called Kalamba. You might have heard about him in the recent Delhi biography. Very well suggest that possibly Gandhi and Kalamba had a sort of deeply homoerotic friendship. Gandhi began to nag Kalamba, bought a pair of costly binoculars that the other owned. Rather than allow those to be a bone of contention between us, why not throw them into the sea and be done with it? And this is his nagging of Kalamba. He will. And then an exasperated Kalamba replied, "Certainly, throw the wretched things away." And Gandhi writes, and forthwith I flung them into the sea. What the episode shows us is that voluntary poverty was for Gandhi less an act of giving than of ridding oneself of things. And I see the difference. The binoculars were not given to somebody. They were thrown into the sea. But he came to write at length about it. It is in these terms of self-dispossession that he primarily described it. I must discard all wealth, all possessions. And I'm quoting from various places in Gandhi's works. Okay, I won't give you the effective. He uses words similar to discard. Give up things. No, not give away things. Give up things. For things slipped away from me. I threw overboard things which I used to consider as mine. A great burden fell off my shoulders. And then he comes to the conclusion, possession seems to me to be a crime. Gandhi's position is taken to its logical conclusion, the extreme logical conclusion, which he does. He always does take things to the extreme possible logical conclusion. So much so that C.F. Andrews compared Gandhi to Savonarola, who is a great fanatic of medieval Europe. You remember the great book burner, the one who was opposed to all forms of luxury and then piled up all the books in Rome and burned them. So this was what C.F. Andrews used to chide Gandhi about. You have to burn things, all this foreign-made goods and luxury goods that were, periodically you made bonfires of. That seemed to him to be Gandhi the fanatic. And he anticipates these problems and he addresses them as moral dilemmas. And some of these problems that have to do with voluntary poverty. One, the conditions of possibility of a life of voluntary poverty, which include the necessity of living on charity. If you're going to be poor, somebody has to give you woman, you're going to be poor, but somebody has to support you. The consequent issues of dependency, debt, and gratitude. Right? The problem presented by real, that is by involuntary poverty. You might choose to be poor, what about those who are really poor? And the status of the physical body. Right? You might not have anything, but what you are, your body. Let me begin with the first of these, the problem of how one might become poor. Gandhi is confronted by the difficulty that a man without possessions must still find a means of subsistence and decides that he has no option except to live purely on the charity of the world. To be a recipient of charity under these circumstances is, however, a different matter from being a real beggar. About beggary and dependency, he expresses a fairly conventional view, quite unlike the radical defense of the case of the voluntarily poor man himself, who's living on charity. So, you see in the autobiography, he'll condemn beggary, he'll condemn those who are living, destitute lives. They have feelings of decency and self-respect, and philanthropy should give them work to do, and instead of doing that, they're giving them charity, don't give them alms, and so forth. I mean, this is a very conventional view of beggars. Alms taking and alms giving must be restricted for Gandhi, it seems, only to those who are voluntarily poor like himself. In this, Gandhi is able to build upon Hindu and Buddhist religious practices that enjoin giving to sannyasis and bhikkhus, who are religious mendicants and renunciants, men who have rendered themselves voluntarily poor and are consequently allowed to live only on charity. Within a closed and self-serving system of donors and donees. That was a give, those who take. The novelty of Gandhi's chosen poverty was that he was not a religious sannyasi, but one who was on the contrary active in secular public life. Such activity would be felt to be incumbent upon a non-religious person living on charity, if he was not to exist as a parasite on society. So if all he did was to take, then he would be a parasite. So you would also have to in some way be useful and to perform some kind of service in society. Living on charity is a contingent and chancy affair that entails subsisting literally from hand to mouth. And I mean literally. You get and you eat. There's nothing put away, right? From day to day. And he became established in national public life. Gandhi's life of poverty naturally became less risky in this sense. Nor was this, and it's obviously there's no risk. No one was going to let Gandhi starve from day to day. And you also know the joke about Sarojini Naidu's joke, right? About how much it costs to keep this, you have no idea how much it costs to keep this old man in power. So goat had to be taken everywhere so that he could have goat's milk and fruit and nuts and so on. So all of this was pretty expensive affair. Nor was his poverty projected as a matter of dependency. And people didn't say, oh, Gandhi depends on others. It became, as it were, agential self-sufficiency. He doesn't need anything. These differences, however, did not prevent Gandhi from embracing the identity of a poor man wholeheartedly. A comment not to be viewed as an accusation of hypocrisy. Now, not at all. I mean, this is deductive to say. I mean, this is math or this is political. But as an acknowledgement of a constitutive contradiction in the unique position he constructed for himself, as simultaneously poor man, which is the subject position he had, and public figure, which is the object of universal charity. So simultaneously subject and object, subject as poor man, object as object of universal charity. And similarly, in the matter of handling debt and accusation of ingratitude, at one time he took out an insurance policy for his family. And when he was very financially insecure, and he had a great crisis of conscience. How can I do this? Did it not betray a lack of confidence in God? Did it not betray a lack of confidence in his brother, who was supporting him, and in his wife and children, who were quite willing to go along with his way of life? Finally, he breathed easily only when he cancelled the policy. As in the case of charity, dependency had to be accepted with humility. And once again, it's a form of living contingently, living on the brink. an ethical demand of poverty that he felt obliged to respond to. And in the same breath, he wrote to his brother, Lakshmidas, that now that he had taken a vow of poverty, it meant that henceforth you should expect nothing from me. And we have accounts of his nephew's biography of him, which says that Lakshmidas had supported Gandhi during the years in London with the expectation that once Gandhi became a barrister, he would support the family in turn, the larger family, not just his own family, but the whole family. So when he refused to do that, there was a rift between the brothers. And his grandson Arun Gandhi says that, I quote, his ingratitude was a cruel blow, a humiliation for the whole family. Gandhi argued that he was in fact supporting his family, only the meaning of family, and I'm quoting Gandhi, had to be slightly widened. And the wisdom of my step would become clear, meaning everybody, the whole world is my family. Gandhi's unilateral cancellation of the debt replaces the obligation of repayment by a different obligation, that of service to a different set of recipients. You take some from somebody, but you give to somebody else, right? So the debt is repaid, but it's not repaid to the one from whom you took it. Rather than confine the debt or the gift that is always implicitly a loan, and I want you to follow me closely here, because the idea of the gift is very central to, well, in this century it's become central to anthropological thought of Mao's and others, which in most societies are built on the notion of the gift, of giving, which is also reciprocated, right? And there's an intimate trajectory here of return and reciprocity. And what Gandhi does is to break out of this circle and sets the gift into a different and dispersed trajectory. Right? The trickiest aspect of the next one, I'll come back to the idea of the gift in a bit. The trickiest aspect of advocating voluntary poverty is, of course, the existence and prevalence of real, that is, involuntary poverty. It's getting on for 4, so those who want to leave, Gandhi is quick to refuse any idealization or compensatory view of poverty as such. And this is to be said to his credit. He's not saying poverty is a great thing. I quote him, I would not go among my fellows who starve and talk of voluntary poverty. I do not tell them how blessed they would be if they changed that involuntary poverty into voluntary. These men have first of all to have the necessities of life before I can talk to them of voluntary poverty. There is therefore a profound paradox that lies at the heart of Gandhi's position. In order to become poor, one cannot be poor to begin with. Right? So the becoming poor is a process. You're already poor, then there's no becoming. It is choice, not lack, which is the key ethical aspect of voluntary poverty. And since Gandhi thought himself able to determine and dictate an ideal measure of needs and wants, he recast poverty in absolute rather than relative terms. That is, in terms of a universally acceptable standard of sufficiency. So that for most of us, poverty is relative. I'm less poor than somebody else, I'm more rich than a particular person. So it's always something that's a relative standard. For Gandhi, because he could decide this and this much is enough, this is what I need to live, and then beyond that, 2 sets of clothes and so many calories of food. So he could actually determine an absolute standard of sufficiency. Now, Gandhian voluntary poverty is not a new idea. And again, I don't want to rehearse all these sources from which the idea of voluntary poverty as an ideal, Hindu ideas, Christian ideas, the thinking of Ruskin, Tolstoy, Thoreau, the Vaishnava saints, the Bhagavad Gita, the Navroji, his guru Rajan by. It's like all of this, and it's not quite like all of these either. And it's not storing up merit through good deeds. It's not a question of premiere. It's not like I'll do without and later on I'll get my rewards in heaven. There is no Christian otherworldliness. When Christianity says that the meek will inherit the earth, Gandhi is not making any such promises. Again, there's no otherworldliness here. No Christian idealization of involuntary poverty. It's not simply a simple life. Although, of course, in the present day world, Gandhi has become a countercultural guru. You know, in the West particularly, Gandhi has become somebody who advocates a simple life. But it's not reducible to that kind of notion of simplicity. It's not into asceticism. It's not quite socialism. He often said, you know, I'm like a socialist, but I'm not a socialist. And he rarely spoke of sacrifice except in the sense of renunciation of giving up. So what can we call this? I think we need to call this a kind of ethical self-centeredness. And I'm making the difference because so often the philosopher Levinas is being called upon as an example of somebody who calls for compassion, the idea of the other, of relating to the other. Gandhi is turning inward. It's ethical self-centeredness. This chosen poverty's justification is in its practitioner's own happiness. As he says, the bliss, the ability that it gives one, without any reference to the good it might do to others. He says, benevolence should have no taste of favor about it. You're not doing somebody else a favor. You can get it for yourself. To serve without desire is to favor not others but ourselves. All these are quotations from Gandhi. Voluntary poverty is not charity. It's not a redistributive project. It's not taking from some and giving to others. And you know that he was an advocate of trusteeship, not of communism. It's not about sharing one's wealth, but sharing the other's poverty. You know, your wealth that you share with others, but at that man's poverty that you share. Not a giving to, but a giving up. Its practice, as he repeatedly emphasizes, results not in personal deprivation, but universal self-sufficiency. Not that I am giving up something, but all of us are going to get something. Which is why he never described it as sacrificial. This poverty would act like a dissemination. You know what dissemination means? It's casting seed, it's throwing things all over the place. Casting, broadcasting, without return. And also without recipients, or only accidental recipients. And you throw things that will fall where it may. So you're not giving it to a person. Through dissemination, one does not seek to forge a relationship with a designated other. One loses oneself. The word dissemination is an echo, but not an invocation of Derrida. This invocation would be legitimate, nevertheless, authorized by the heterogeneous sources. Gandhi himself, very eclectic, he borrowed from everywhere. So had the contemporaries, he might well have borrowed from Derrida. He didn't, but that's only because of their different historical context. Derrida's own repeated returns to the question of the impossibility of the gift come close to capturing Gandhi's endeavors. Derrida posits a radical benevolence that would have to lie entirely outside the motivations, the context, the conditions in which benevolence is usually viewed. It should not emerge from a mere superfluity of possessions or get caught up in the circuits of exchange. And I'm quoting Derrida, he says the gift must remain uneconomic, not UN, aneconomic, A-N-E-C-N-O-M-I-C, outside of the circuits of an economy of giving, taking, circulation. And further, unlike acts of philanthropy or charity, it should have to be free of moral calculation. What will I get if I give? That should not be there. In one place, Derrida succinctly describes what I have labored to convey here. The gift, he says, is that which one does not have. Why is it viewed in as such a crucial ethical project, this giving without expectation of return? And why is it also impossible? Impossible is, again, the Derridian term, impossible. It's not, and yet you use it, right? Deconstruction is the using of things that you cannot outlive. And you know it's impossible. As Derrida explains the gift and giving in his book of love, when someone gives something to someone, one is already long within calculating dialectics and speculative idealization. The contamination even of the pure gift is inescapable. I quote again. At the limit, the gift as gift ought not to appear as gift, either to the donee or the donor. If the other perceives or receives it, if he or she keeps it as gift, the gift is annulled. The gift, Derrida says, puts the other in debt, with the result that giving amounts to hurting, to doing harm. In other words, as Mao's and others, and all those who study primitive societies, but also more sophisticated societies, every gift is a calculation. You have to get it back eventually. And you know that with wedding gifts, you always note down how much somebody gave in your family, so that at the time when they have a wedding in their family, you can give it back. And it's all linked to status, it has to do with circulation. Although ostensibly gift is a free thing, it means no price attached to it. In effect, it is not. There is no such thing as a gift. The gift is impossible. Right? It puts the other in debt unless you return it, okay? And it's doing harm. Derrida might be speaking on Gandhi's behalf in the matter of Gandhi's unilateral cancellation of his debt to his brother, when he insists that the true impossible gift requires that the donee not give back. The donee owes it to himself not to give back. He ought not give back. This is Derrida's. And all the emphasis that I put there are in Derrida's original. Okay, I'm not added. It is this care about refraining from gifting or returning the debt, but despite it entering the circuit of the gift, which is nothing less than the social itself. You can't live in society and not give. Now that circulation is the cement. That is what keeps us all going. You give and you return and so on. Now this is what Gandhi impossibly managed in his life's experiments. And as Gandhi gets older and he gets deeper into political life, the practice of voluntary poverty actually becomes stricter. He becomes more and more demanding of himself. Primarily at the beginning, as you know, it was a lifestyle of simplicity, of not being extravagant. And then he said to have integrity in public life, especially in India, you have to be poor like the masses. But then it became an issue of nationalist politics. And this happened after he read Dadabhai Naoroji's Poverty and British Rule in India. And at Devi, he says, the first acquaintance with the extent of Indian poverty. It becomes a structural issue, that poverty is not something that some people are poor, but poverty is a condition of lack, of dispossession. Poverty ceased to be simply the tautological condition of the poor, and was, if not newly, certainly more acutely perceived as a consequence of the immiseration of the people, which was caused by colonial rule and capitalist exploitation. To Gandhi's attempt to reconcile this structural understanding of poverty with its existential and ethical aspects produced contradictions. And this became particularly acute in his public and political life. What if I just talk for a minute? Anyone else who wants to So as far as poverty then goes as a matter of possession, Gandhi sought nothing else than to become the figure of the oppressed, to become the poor, to not just identify with them, but to himself became poor. And for him it meant adopting a number of symbolic outward marks of poverty. Most famous of those being his dress, as you know, where the homespun loincloth, his desert, his diet, the dwelling in the ashram, the program of spinning, and his favored modes of transportation, which is walking and third-class train travel. So all of these have been extensively analyzed as semiotics of outward signs of poverty, and what it meant and how it impacted. You know much of that. He himself analyzed that very often, and others since then. Emataro has a book on dress and the meaning of the adoption of simple lists and so forth. Now this was a public and performative aspect of voluntary poverty, and it was achieved through the modalities of exemplarity and service. Exemplarity is that the mode of being an example, of serving as an example. The simple life would not only allow him to live among the poor and gain credibility among them, it would also serve as an inspiration and bring hope to the poor. And this is what he said. They would say, he's happy, though he possesses nothing. How is it? I do not need to argue with them. They begin to argue for themselves. So he impresses by simply being, that is by his authenticity, or the non-contradiction between practice and preaching, which is very important for any public figure to say one thing and to be a different thing, immediately strikes the others as being inauthentic or hypocritical. So he brings those two things together. So, and he is not poor as the poor are poor. He simultaneously fashions himself as an exemplary model of the condition that he embraces. He often urges, for example, that simple cleanliness and contentment will make poverty tolerable as well as virtuous. So one of the things that I see, strikes you very often when you read Nehru or Gandhi, how often they are lecturing people in a very pedagogical. And it's like, use soap and water, wash your clothes every day. You know, that we all these very lessons in hygiene. So you don't, just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to live in filth. You know, so there are a lot of these things like, how can you be poor and yet contented, and yet clean, and yet virtuous, and you don't have to drink, you mustn't do the practices. You know, all of Ambedkar does this, Gandhi does this. You know, quite often there are these ways in which they're very pedagogic, but it helps if we can be an example of that itself. So the authenticity of being poor should have sufficed, right? I'm preaching poverty, I'm myself poor. But he also wanted to go beyond that. What he wanted to do was to perform service, acts of service. And even though they would include differences of status and power, and identification in being exactly like the other, but through teaching, through exemplarity, you put a distance between yourself and the other. He had a compulsion to serve, physical service by means of the body's performance. This is the last thing that I mentioned in my list. What about the body? Is it being or having? Are you your body or do you have your body? If you have your body, then it's a possession. You have to give it away, right? So the means of the body's performative labors is the only form of gifting left to a donor who has renounced all other worldly possessions. And then it remains still an ambiguous form of giving. He confronted the ontological question of the body's relationship to the self. He separated, now this is obviously a deeply philosophical question, what is the self? And he separates the body from the self. He says, in order to realize the ideal of voluntary poverty in its fullness, I must not possess anything on this earth as my property, not even this body, because this body is also a possession. So one does not even own one's own body, one must, he says, use it as a temporary possession, which while it is at one's disposal must be used for service and service whole of our waking hours. So the body has a central place in Gandhi's schema. It must be worn out like a pair of slippers with continual use, the proverb has it. It is through the body's performative labors that he offers this service to suffering humanity. A seva, this whole idea of seva or service in here right now, Ajay Skaria, a wonderful essay that he writes on the ashram. The idea of Skaria talks of seva as Gandhi's response to the incoherence and injustice of the application of liberalism's ideas of equality. And he says equality does not make sense when you're talking of the subaltern. And so Gandhi levels the playing ground, as it were, by introducing the idea of service.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the name that you used about the essay.
Ajay Skaria says that yes, if you apply liberalism, liberal ideas of equality, liberalism is that whole idea of equality, fraternity, liberty, and so on, which are part of the Enlightenment, and of course they are the major ideas of British thought as well, like John Stuart Mill and others. Equality for Gandhi doesn't make sense in context in which people are so radically unequal. With the subaltern, both the Harijan, and the Harijan becomes actually the crux of the problem for him, and the poor. So, Gandhi wants to acknowledge hierarchies of social relations. Everybody is not equal. There are hierarchies, and he uses a religious idiom for the poor. He calls them Daridra Narayan, the divine poor, and this is problematic, mind you. And the untouchable, he calls Harijan, children of God. And what he offers them, instead of a false liberal equality, is the devotion of seva. Okay? Now, I think we can argue about this. I mean, this could seem equally problematic. It was for Ambedkar, for instance, and for many in the radical caste movement. It seemed like Harijan and the idea of Gandhi asking upper caste to perform seva to the Harijan was condescending. It was. But this was what Scalia is trying to say, is that even Gandhi's idea of the non-applicability of liberalisms, which was a ruling and dominant notion of bringing about egalitarianism, he brings in the idea of seva. Now, seva is contradictory when you think of it in terms of service to the other. It's different from forms of giving. It's not like giving wealth. The body laboring on behalf of the other comes close to constituting itself as gift. It becomes gift-like. Whereas voluntary poverty is solipsistic and self-centered. In other words, you can take a unilateral decision to become poor, right? You can decide for yourself, I'm going to be poor. You don't have to consult somebody else about it. But service, like friendship, is tied to the other. You cannot serve somebody without at least saying, can I serve you? Do you want my help? You cannot be friends with somebody who will say, can I be your friend? Will you be my friend? So there is a kind of an exchange, whereas poverty, that's why I say solipsistic, it concerns only you. So Gandhi tried to put seva in the same place as voluntary poverty, when it came to the body, giving the body, serving, seva. But it doesn't work in the same way. Cannot unilaterally decide to serve or befriend the other. Is not service predicated on acceptance of service or friendship, is on reciprocity? Can it even ever be anything more than a response to a prompt and unequivocal to a request framed by the other? In other words, you can only help somebody if somebody asks you for help. You cannot go and trust your help on them. You cannot trust service. There's every likelihood that help proffered without reference to the other's will render the other impotent, helpless. Your help will make the other helpless because you're taking over what he might do for himself, self-sufficiency. And this applies specifically to the issue of caste and because the conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar and of other caste leaders were caustic in their disapproval of upper caste civil service that turned many Dalits into recipients of charity. Vijay Prashad, for instance, has written recently about this aspect of Gandhian caste politics. Prashad says that Gandhi didn't argue for the emancipation from Dalithood, but for reform within Dalit. So this becomes, as it were, something that refers to upper caste agency in addressing the caste issue rather than Dalit agency in addressing caste. So he brings Dalit and peasant politics within the ambit of bourgeois and upper caste seva. Seva might be a counter to liberal equality, but it also checks the revolutionary agency of subalterns themselves. Right? It substitutes for their agency. And And not only that, but he claimed monopoly over the caste issue, and he opposed any lower caste activism such as satyagraha or political initiatives such as separate electorates that addressed aspects of caste other than untouchability. So he keeps caste within the ambit of reformability. The intractable obstacle to seeing seva as a response to untouchability, analogous to voluntary poverty as a response to real poverty, lies in caste's immutability. Even when Gandhi undertook to perform the degraded labors of the untouchables, you know that he tried to clean out their sins and so on, he took on those kinds of stigmatized labor that he could not make him untouchable, that voluntary poverty could make him poor. He could only occupy the upper caste position, and seva becomes reparation. Seva doesn't make him untouchable, it makes him an upper caste who is trying to reform. Right? So his doctrine of seva, like his economic prescriptions, was also evidence of his anti-statism. And in other words, he didn't want the state to intervene in rectifying these situations. The socialism where the state would redistribute well, or the state would pass legislation and give affirmative action or forbid untouchability. He was not looking for state interference. His non-revolutionary praxis, fearing violence, sought to retain the status quo of class, gender and class relations, relying instead on a change of heart, which would put the onus of transforming social structures on those who are in possession of power and privilege. This much by way of evidence is obvious. Even in voluntary poverty, I mean, very often he talked to the poor about voluntary poverty. He rarely talked to his rich friends about giving up their wealth. And very few of them followed him. Anyway, I mean, all the builders and other rich capitalists who he retained as friends, he never persuaded them to give up their wealth. So the status quo, largely he keeps things as they are, without trying to change that, and that's because largely this is a non-revolutionary movement. What I propose, nevertheless, is the likelihood that Gandhi was not oblivious to the possibility and the shape of the recalcitrant subaltern response to such initiatives. What do you think the subaltern should do? We have talked so far about voluntary poverty on the part of Gandhi, seva on the part of Gandhi, but what should the subaltern do in response? Seva could not but descend into gift, and Gandhi was thwarted by the inability to find a moral strategy similar to voluntary poverty in his response to caste. But there is nothing in the logic of his positions on either trusteeship or seva that scripts gratitude or acquiescence as the recipient others' only possible response. He never tells them, accept this is the only thing you can do. He has little to say about his expectations of the recipient of seva, concentrating instead on the behavior expected of those whose duty it is to perform it. That resistance is articulated as ingratitude of the kind that many Dalits express towards the programs of the Harijan Sevak Sangh. And this would cancel debt most effectively. We say, I'm not going to say thank you, right? And simply, and that way I'm cancelling the debt. You think I owe you something because you did me something, not so. Restoring seva to the domain of giving without remembrance. Such non-expectation of return is a key teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. You do things and you don't expect anything in return, which is one of Gandhi's major intellectual and spiritual resources. I want to push this a little further. Consider also as a variation of this by way of a more active expectation of non-return. I'm not talking of non-expectation of return, but an expectation of non-return. You actually expect not to get anything back, right? Which is Levinas's description of the self-transcendent relation to the other. And Levinas talks about a movement without return. And quoting, a work conceived in its ultimate nature requires a radical generosity of the same who in a work goes unto the other. It then requires an ingratitude of the other. The real generosity is not only when you give and don't expect anything in return, but when you give and expect the other to respond your gift. or to say, well, and you only gave me what I deserve, or forget it and walk away with it. Now, that kind of resistance to giving is what Levinas actually talks about as the self, the attitude of the self to the other. So, inherent in this communitarian self-sufficiency and the worker non-cooperation that Gandhi so staunchly supported is an intransigent ingratitude that functions as a practical ethics of subaltern response to the gift of service as much as to the injustice against which it is more overtly directed. So it's not only the situation in which this inequality is obtained, but the fact that various forms of resistance to gifting and giving and redistribution and seva are enacted that are actually constitutively part of what Gandhi was, I think, attempting in his modalities of ethics that I outlined here. Okay, I'm going to stop and not get into Nehru. It's a very different set of ethics which have to do more with independent India and the fact of actual democracy, the functioning of democracy, where Gandhi very poignantly talks about in his destiny speech, where Gandhi had talked about wiping every tear from every eye, and when he speaks of Gandhi's, and of course Gandhi was not present at when Nehru made the speech. He says, the ambition of the greatest man of our generation has been to wipe every tear from every eye. And Nehru both honors that wish, but he reframes it. That may be beyond us. But as long as there are tears and suffering, so long our work will not be over. And the difference between here, Gandhi's desire to wipe every tear from every eye, seva, which is, and his own more limited, and but nevertheless onerous responsibility as a political leader. So this is making his promises weighty and responsible, but there's still work to be done as long as there are tears. So I think that marks the shift from Gandhi's anti-colonial politics, mobilization of the, which is, and his own more limited, and but nevertheless onerous responsibility as a political leader. So this is making his promises weighty and responsible, but there's still work to be done as long as there are tears. So I think that marks the shift from Gandhi's anti-colonial politics, mobilization is never, over, but it cannot be satisfied. So that is the sort of excess that Nehru ascribes to Gandhi, and says we cannot do that. That great man wanted this to be done, but we will do our best as leaders. And I talk about again this question of responsibility, which sometimes replicates the anachronistic mode of noblesse oblige, which in that situation of elites and masses becomes like a feudal relationship, which you cannot have in a democracy. And how Gandhi negotiates this, and I think Nehru negotiates this, I think with an acute awareness of what a democracy means in a situation where those who were anti-colonial leaders are now the nations. And so that becomes the second part of my paper class. Do you have questions about visas? I think I just come up there. You don't need this.
A world apart from the Western philosophies that India has adopted. So, do you see a place, in the current Indian polity for Gandhi's political philosophies?
It's a very good question, I think, yeah. And precisely, I think Rajeswari and others are working on this, because primarily we work with liberal ideas, right? And because the structure is of democracy. And this is what Spivak calls categoristic. Okay? It's something that is transferred from one context to another, which is an observation, which is not a criticism. Okay? The fact that something originated in one place and has been transferred to another place does not mean that therefore it has no fit, no good fit, but it also means that it is an outlet. Right? It's a different kind of context. And I think with what, and Gandhi himself is not pure indigenous figure. It's obviously a very modern figure, and he's, as I said, very eclectic. It's very difficult to pin down his ideas to any one source. If another book to look at is Leela Gandhi's Affective Communities, in which she looks at Gandhi in a particular phase of his life, which is the London phase and the late 19th century. Even his vegetarianism. Now you think vegetarianism for Gandhi is obviously he's a vegetarian. To start with, his mother's vegetarian, his religion is vegetarian. Yet, so his vegetarianism was part of his upbringing, was an inherent prejudice for many of us. It was not enough for him. So for him, vegetarianism had also to be rationalized and justified. And she traces a genealogy for it, which comes not from caste and Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism, but from the group of Quaker vegetarians in London at the time. Mostly crackpots of various kinds, very marginal figures. They're all, it's what you call a minor politics. She doesn't say crackpots, I don't think, I'm just saying. But there are all these people, and you saw pamphlets written by Rajeswari, I think, on vegetarianism. He read it, he was greatly impressed by it, he writes to them, he becomes part of the vegetarian group, and then the vegetarian thing goes to what she calls zoophilia. It starts with Leslie Bentham, 18th century, Darwin, those who establish a kinship with animals, that becomes an anti-vivisectionist and a vegetarian. So how do you say that Gandhi gets his ideas from any one source? They obviously get reinforced by ideas he gets elsewhere. That's why one of the things I didn't do was to say the idea of voluntary poverty came from here or here or here. It comes from any place. So, how does it fit into a modern liberal democratic society? Is a good question. I think obviously the figures who are closest to Gandhi today, in his own time, is called an anarchist. Now, anarchism, if you want a label, if you want, something that he himself went to Socrates, or that could parallel to be drawn there, would not function within the idea of governmentality, of a Foucauldian notion of a welfare state, of a little state. It would be anarchistic. So it was, as many people said, just when he died, when he did, because he would have been very uncomfortable in present-day structure and in an independent nation state. So, but what kinds of fits there are, I think people are very interested in looking at that, and much more than me. I think people like Uday Venkat are also looking at non-violence, not simply in terms of pacifism, which is how it tends to be seen in the West, is in the context of present-day terrorism, for instance. I've talked elsewhere of terrorism and the hunger clause, the suicide bomber versus the person who caused son to death. It's similarly anarchistic. But the fast unto death, simply because it's a longer process, it takes a while for the person to die. It does not. It allows for a certain space of negotiation, right? It's unlike suicide bombing. They're both forms of suicide, but they're different forms of suicide. They're both anarchistic. So I think people are interested now. Again, Derrida is very interested. There's a essay on politics and ethics where it can be Gandhi. And he doesn't, unfortunately, but it can be Gandhi. So I think the interesting project to take on. I'm not sure I have an answer already made, but I think very good ones at looking at Gandhi in relation to political thought.
The first is that there is a big difference between suicide bomber and elderly, and somebody could pass that to death. The first round Chief Vishwanathan pointed out that most of Gandhi's past and death were for self-purification. Rather, the quoting a demand from the state or someone. So it was not that Gandhi went and passed them to death, you don't take me for burger or pizza. It was not. It's just that, I think I made a mistake of that I purify myself. So it is not really a process of death one part. The second thing is, more about the terms that you use from Gandhi's dictionary. So he seems to be using terms like Dalit Narayan, Harijan, Satyagre, or no, most of these terms come from Hindu religious. Dalit Narayan seems to remind us of Dalit Lakshmi. But the idea of Dalit Lakshmi is much older than the idea of or at least much older than the Gandhian notion of Dalit Narayan. Similarly, the idea of Harijan, it goes all the way back to Kabir. Kabir also borrowed it from others. Now, how is Gandhi how is Gandhi choosing these terms? Because Gandhi does not choose colloquial version. He chooses the censored version. Because the Kabir versions in different parts of the country, the word Harijan is not necessarily Harijan, it takes local forms. But Gandhi looks at the country and he chooses the Sanskrit equivalent of this family of terms. Now, how does he, for someone who is not really well read in Indian literature, to my knowledge, he was not like Ambedkar, who was really deep into Sanskrit or Shastra, right? So, someone who is not really well read in Indian literature, choosing so cleverly and so swiftly is something that's always surprised me. And most of his terms had an instant ring like the Beatles using something in the whole world singing that, Gandhi uses it and the whole country sings that. So would you like to say something on the linguistics of his politics?
I don't think I could say it any better than you. I think you said it so well. Yeah, you're right. I mean, and besides the point you're making, that he's not well read. Even his reading of the Bhagavad Gita is very amateurish, right? I mean, there's so many people who annotate the Bhagavad Gita and who have written scholarly. Tilak and others have all have done very much more scholarly. You're quite right. I mean, so which is why I said the word eclectic is not a systematic philosophy. And people like Bilgami are actually systematizing it in some way, and also seeing, making it all of a piece, coherence in his thought. Whereas he was much more accurate when he said experiments with it, because there is something very contingent about, what the way he does it. Today he'll say this, and tomorrow the opportunity to correct himself, to modify what he said. And here is a man who is not he's not saying something and people accepting it. He's constantly in argument. People are questioning him. People's, throughout in his journals, in his magazines, he is answering questions. A doctor writes to him and says, "What is this?" Another man writes to him, "What do you mean by this?" So, and hence, Swaraj itself is written in the form of an editor and reader. But both are Gandhi. But he anticipates questions. So this man never once was accepted unquestioned. He was constantly being questioned, challenged, including by his closest followers, Nehru and others, who kept being exasperated by it. So there was nothing there that was, when you are saying a coined word, Satyagraha is a coined word. It's a compound word which he makes up. It doesn't exist in the, it brings two words together, and as we said, that and Harijan, and others are words that he coins and that gives a particular kind of meaning.
You should really pick up Hindi. Because I'm not read a few other things, so really.
Gujarati, I think.
No, but you could use Hindi in the later stage of his life. And similarly, because some of the early Gujarati, because then they picked up Hindi, Calcutta. So this is very clear that it is collected letters. He very clearly mentioned that Keshan's saying instigated him to pick up Hindi. And he said only then you will be heard across the country. But who instigated Gandhi to pick up Hindi? Because Porbandar is not a Hindi speaking area. This side, you can pick up Hindi from Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh or Nagpur. But Gandhi comes from an area which is and then from Porbandar he goes straight to England if I'm not wrong, and South Africa. So, I mean, the linguistics of this, this person is something which has to be explored. So I'm not expert, so I will not really say how he made these choices of language, because Gandhi was the biggest, campaigner for Hindi within the Congress, if you say. So he had some differences on script with Purushottam Das, but otherwise he was a campaigner, and Mysore, Bangalore, Chennai have Dakshin Bharat Hindi Festival. So how does this person choose his language? Because that perhaps was his biggest weapon. He didn't have anything else. It was his words, and the simplicity and the appeal of the words which really made him what he was. So maybe something.
Both I think linguistically and conceptually, I mean, they're just derived different. So that is a great deal of grappling with the language, which he actually tried to come up with. Even truth, even the idea of truth and so on. I mean, this is so different things. It has a much more theoretical sense in the Western context. The idea of truth. It has to do so much with the kind of empiricism and also the idea of testimony and of legality. Obviously, Gandhi sees truth in a much more metaphysical and spiritual sense. So I think that there is a difference in the ways in which translation and the meanings of words and
just to add to this linguistic geographical visits Sivagram happens to be extremely close to one of the most important Mughal cantonments and British cantonments. So the apostle of non-violence making his headquarters next to one of the biggest centers of colonial control and Mughal control before that, and even before that Ahmednagar. So there is something about him which symbolism, his understanding of the country. He was not a geographer, historian, but he could understand significance and.
I think even with terms like passive resistance, somewhere passive resistance I can't remember now, but it is used in some context, not Gandhi's violence. But I think he's very disturbed by that phrase, because it gives entirely the wrong sense of what he had in mind. And non-violence, again, it's framed as it's a term of the negative of violence. So again, it's not giving that affirmative idea that he wants sense of another. So both of these are translations, and adequacy of these terms is obviously insufficient. So I think there is good scholarly work to be done in where he derives some of these, and he did have a group. I think that the idea of Rajan, which has probably not been looked at. There's very interesting kind of references to him. He's looking for a group. I need a teacher. I'm going to learn from someone. But never actually, succumbing to that discipline of apprenticing himself to somebody who is a teacher. And I think that structure of guru and shishya, and both yearns for it and yet cannot accommodate it. So maybe, you say he derives something from a guru. And
Aurobindo, and Aurobindo said, you need to be here, you just go away, you just move out from this. So he tried, sensitive, because he saw Aurobindo somebody who was so, but Aurobindo didn't entertain him because he said I can leave you on your own, you don't need to. I think so. And he went Tagore also with some sort of expectations of, whatever, but they differed, very much on a number of things.
If he had the luxury of retrospect, could he have been have reframed this whole approach to the political?
It's kind of speculative, what you're asking for the kind of experiment. I mean, because what's interesting is that the brink of independence and Nehru have a long correspondence, about the program for independent India, economic and otherwise. And you actually two people are sitting here and flashing out, the destinies of several million people. It's actually they're going back and forth. But what I think is interesting and most radically interesting that when Gandhi, seeing him as somebody who is a leader of the freedom movement, and you think that the goal of the freedom movement is political independence, and the shape of political independence will be that of politication, which is what the Chatterjee calls derivative discourse. The idea that the political freedom will result in what else but the nation form. So the nation form is the limits of our imagination, which is what Chatterjee says. There's no other way in which you could think of. Think of Kashmir. I mean, if Kashmiris say, what do you want? We want to be an independent nation. You say, out of your mind, that how can you be an independent nation? But what else can they think of themselves as being? Those are the limits of the imagination. But for Gandhi, almost seemed like he was talking in terms of not having a standing army. What kind of nation state does not have a standing army? He was talking of village republics. He was talking of independent, self-sufficient, they're growing their own food and no army, no, as far as one can see, not even a currency that would unite the whole country. He didn't think of linguistic reorganization of states. He wasn't thinking of any of the problems of independence. It's not there in his mind. And that is the most radically surprising thing, because there was an anti-colonial politics, but even in Hind Swaraj, you're not seeing anything about let the British leave India, then give us our political freedom. He's not even saying that. Mental state. And let them change. You want the tiger without the tiger's nature, you want to take over, transfer of power is not enough. There is more investment in what the shape of the independent nation would be. And it is certainly not imagined in terms of the conventional nation state. And I think that is the major kind of surprise that comes to you. Because very few of us, and certainly very few political anti-colonial figures, very few political scientists, have thought outside of the shape of the nation state. And even Dr. Chatterjee says that, it's a derivative discourse, those are the limits of our imagination. But what else are we thinking of? There are, you get some subnational things and, more supranational entities like the European Union and so on are coming up now. But more and more they become like a nation. Europe is a supranational, but a nation country. It has a euro in common and so it really seems that we are not able to think outside of the nation state. Gandhi did. Even if it was in that bizarre mode of the village republics. It was a sort of you can't call it feudal, but it certainly was not, you might call it post-national if you like. Or you think of Nedvi and Ha. You think of somebody completely like postmodern politics of empire, which is, if the nation is obsolete, let's think of empire. So somewhere you have to put Gandhi in a framework where, of course, Tagore was also not a nationalist, right? And he's what you call cosmopolitan because you want a formula, which is nationalist or a cosmopolitan or a universalist. He called it universalist. But there were these thinkers in India who were not necessarily thinking in terms of a free Indian nation state. They're fixated on that idea. And I think that's the interesting part. So I don't know what might have.
Maybe two examples, two concrete examples. See, many of the northeastern tribal communities still preserve Gandhi's note saying that free to leave the country. So two of them are very important. First is that the Naga Hills district Fiso and others claimed that they visited Gandhi in New Delhi, and they said that if people of Nagaland are really not interested in joining India or Pakistan or Burma, then they should be absolutely free to leave the country. There is no force. I mean, at least I won't face this, this in India, keeping doing this. Now, Nehru and others were surprised that this man is a bit confused, I guess. And then what happened? Gopinath Bardoli, one of the only, I think, the only Bharat Ratna from Northeast India. He is premier of United Assam. He came to Gandhi and said that it seems that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, at that time Gandhi was not Khalif, if I'm not wrong, somewhere in that stretch. He said, Vallabhbhai Patel and Nehru want to leave us to Pakistan, that we should join the East of Pakistan, and we are absolutely against. This will be the death of the Northeastern tribe, with this of Christians, whatever Hindus. So we said, if you think that this is against your interest, so then you should leave the union. They shouldn't, they would, you cannot force at all. Now, he didn't give them a complete idea of, what you are going to do afterward, but he said, you are free to leave this. First leave it and then think of, what you are going to do afterwards. So this was, this happened, and this is interesting in terms of mythology. At least Gopinath Bardoli, we have got, archival evidence saying that he actually met all these things happen. But in case of these smaller tribal groups, it's kind of mythology that that everyone has a Gandhian, copper plate saying that you are independent. So there, here Gandhi is confronted, with a concrete problem, and he gives a very statement that you can leave, and these answers always baffled his junior colleagues in Congress, like Nehru, Patel. It is management to let the country fall apart and that is being forced to put together. So, these mythologies also have to be explored to recover what Gandhi thought about what will happen in those small places after they become independent. And there is no army, there is nothing there actually. So, what happens? So these mythologies are not true historical accounts. We know that, but after controlling this fact, we should recover Gandhi's philosophy, political philosophy from these areas, not from the collected volumes or the national exchanges at that level. But again, I'm not sure if this has been done so far, because I'm not a student of Gandhian literature, but I think this has to be done and going to each and every tribe and to similar stories are there for other communities of India also.
I think very broadly speaking of Gandhi, there's a question about the absolute and the position that he takes. If it's not absolute, if you don't say absolute poverty, if you don't say absolute non-violence, then what's the meaning of it? If it is qualified, it is somewhat poor or somewhat non-violent, then it doesn't make. These things have to be absolute or they're not. But at the same time, obviously the absolute, people will come up with what, if somebody is self-defensive, what about euthanasia, and all the questions that come up in the question of non-violence. Okay? Then you have to have limits. So what are the limits of, not qualification, maybe what are the limits of non-violence, what are the limits of. So I think those things are a real challenge to Gandhi. Much of the questions that he tackles, of course everybody asks him what would happen if he had been a Jew in Hitler's Germany, what would he have done? And he actually, there's a lot of now, there's a new issue of studies in the humanities and social sciences. It comes out from the Institute of Advanced Studies. The latest issue has very nice pieces on Gandhi. One of them actually looks at all of Gandhi's positions taken on the Jews in Nazi Germany, and he basically tells them to surrender, to not fight back and pacify. But what he does very interestingly in the essay social links up the question of the Jews in Nazi Germany with the question of Zionism, with the question of Israel as a home for Jews and the question of Palestine and Zionism, which very few people at that time in the 1940s were actually linking of the two. And he does. So he says, no, you should not ask for your nation space. The idea of Zionism of a Jewish nation state, you should assimilate in Europe. And this has caused a lot of offense to the Jews. But that's the prescience of Gandhi, was that at that time I can think, my God, there the idea of the nation state and as a kind of a refuge for persecuted Jews in Europe did not strike him as a good idea. So I think there is, I think in each case, Gandhi's, the limits of Gandhian thought, I think that's what is interesting a lot of thinkers today, is to see, what if. Just exactly as the question you asked, as a kind of an experiment, what if, this question of Zionism, and he did address. And so there are, I think, lessons to be had from there, but I'm not sure that the more systematizing notion of, extrapolating from Gandhi's work and streamlining it will actually be the best way to think about it. It's more like a suggestive ideas, and the more that there is a logic to this thought, it holds together. It's not coherent, but we can follow the logic of his thinking, which is what I try to do. Is not so much hold a brief for it, because frankly I'm appalled by some of the things, the things that he says, but it's the logic, it holds together. And particularly the logic of the gift, which for Derrida is simply aphoretic. The gift will be impossible. And Gandhi breaks that circuit. You take from one, don't return to the other, send it to somebody else. You disseminate and break the circuitry of the gift. That to me was, a certain notion of ambassador thinking, and as certain kind of values. And its applicability or its practicability, I mean, those, I think, and for the lots of rebuttals, I put some of them in my footnotes about, the fact that it could be a public figure who was a personal tyrant. So much of this, meant that imposing poverty on his children and tyranny that he exercised as patriarch and so on. I mean, those are, I'm not saying they're irrelevant. I'm not at all saying, oh, that's personal, that's it. I think they're irrelevant, but I didn't want to simply, upstage one of his positions by bringing out something else that downstage him, but showing that. But some of this is constituted. Some of this is part, it goes with the territory. To think in those terms. Trusteeship, again, very interesting idea, very complex idea. But trusteeship as against socialism, because he doesn't think that holding wealth is a very comfortable thing. You can keep your wealth, but you can't spend it. You can't spend it. But you can't give it away. It's going to make you very uncomfortable. And that idea of trusteeship is something I think is, again, in larger economic terms and so on, how does that work? I'm not sure. Who can institutionalize it? Who can turn it into an aspect of governmentality? Those are good questions, but I'm not sure that I can answer this. And you're right, I mean, he's not, if you ask him about the shape of the nation state and, who should be there, who should go, how do we draw the boundaries and so on, he'd probably say, anyone can come, anyone can go, don't have boundaries. And there's one of the ironies of history is, in spite of all the anti-colonial struggles, and Agnes is there, you've heard of as a great poet and a great activist and a great figure of African anti-colonial politics, only died the other day as a mayor of Martinique, which remains to this day a colony of France, and refused independence. And sometimes I think, what if Afghanistan were to tell the United States, make us the 54th state of the United States, simply, let's be part of the United States of America. What would that mean for America? Would they say, very well, we will, we'll make you one of us. Or will they say, no way, and they say, we'll only bomb you, we want, So what are you fighting the war for? Was that fought for conquest? Was that fought for annexation? If you don't want to conquer us, if you don't want to annex us, why are you fighting? We want to be annexed. So what does it matter? We are far away. I mean, Alaska is far away, Hawaii is far away. That's how little states of the United States all over the world. There's urgency or whatever, why mutually beneficial, but nobody's thinking.
What shock question decided to prestige does Gandhi borrow from Indian thought or from Calvinist or because when Gandhi started system of prestige when VK Sarkar political or acknowledged the political science whatever, he also started building his idea of prestige from the Arthashastra and other texts. So does the Gandhian notion of prestige come from the Indian sources or from whatever was contemporary thought people have given from the Protestant notion of prestige?
If you look at websites and so on, Gandhi is very often on Christian, or more evangelical Christian websites. He's just surprising. Also, he's a counterculture figure. People who want lifestyle alterations. I'm not making fun of them, but these are mostly people who are looking for different diets and different things like that. So there is a whole countercultural movement, and because I think its influence is much in that territory, not so much. Of course, we are now hearing about someone like Anand being a Gandhian figure. Now, how seriously people are saying that, or are they simply, reaching out for some convenient label? I don't know. Because I remember that when I was younger and teaching in Delhi University. It was a very unionized. Delhi University was very unionized, and people would constantly be on strike, and they would be going on strikes and so on. And one of our colleagues' father was Kumar Shankar Joshi, who was an old Gandhian and very closely associated with Gandhi. He would say, hunger strikes are the last resort. There is such a discipline involved in that. Civil disobedience comes with so many rules. It is not something you do like that. And it was for him, and it was such a shock for him. And when I was in Oxford in 2004, and that was the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, the US fighting, and there was a lot of anti-war protests in Britain, as really large turnout. Oxford was a bit slower, it was not a very nice political place, but eventually it did take off. And some people were using the word civil disobedience, and they were sitting on the street. The police had to lift them and And I kept saying, look, you need to have study groups first. You really need to read and understand civil disobedience. You cannot just go and sit on the street. There's just a lot there. And Gandhi himself had to tell people that, that you have to study it. It's like any other technique in that particular technology of fighting. There are rules. It's like holding a gun and whatever, you have to do that. And I think that's somewhat of that has to be realized in some ways. Something that we do.
Please excuse my verbosity, but the whole idea of debt, trust, issue, and his picking up from various places where he finds it suits him, and multiple Gandhis within Gandhi and Gandhianism. Isn't he challenging the very idea of private ownership in the sense and private property in the sense that when he says that there is trust issue, he says that you just have administrative rights over various things, even language. So you may borrow things from wherever you find it convenient or wherever you find it good for yourself. And also in the sense that when he talks of debt, personal debt versus his notion of universal debt, in the sense that since you just have administrative rights over various things that you possess, it does not belong to you, so I need not pay you back since it belongs to to the world. So I'm paying it back to the world. So,
Yes. You said it well. I think that's the idea that, nobody, as he said, that my body is my temporary possession.
so even body and language were not his possessions first.
Yes.
His property first.
At the same time, you cannot also say reject responsibility for it. You cannot say it's not mine. I committed a murder, but my body is not mine. My hand did it, or Also, that argument is used by several. A certain sense of movement, or certain. Children do that. I didn't knock down the vase, my hand brushed it aside. So a sense of detaching some part of yourself from yourself. So I think there is a problem with what you claim as yourself, including your brother. And say, I'm holding it in trust, but nevertheless you are holding it. And he's not holding it. You are holding it. So to that extent, you have a responsibility. So
responsibility to the larger world or the universe per se, rather than one specific individual or institution or time.
Which is why I say it's interesting that the question of repayment of debt or gratitude of any form of reciprocity, I did this, you do this, never comes up with this word because of precisely what you are saying. That sense of why should I? It's not yours that I should thank you for giving. So even with colonial rule, he says the British didn't conquer us, we let ourselves be conquered. Which strangely enough is like Cambridge historians' interpretation of colonial history, where they give you all the agency. The colonized people colonize themselves. So in a sense it left these British colonialism, quite but Gandhi said that before they did. He said, we allowed ourselves. So in a sense there is an agency, there is a responsibility. Dostoevsky said that. It's not just a murderer, but there is a murdering. The one who allowed himself to be killed. So which in a sense, turns victimology on its head, because every victim is responsible for his victim. So which is quite important. Shouldn't be an allegory for those who rest, but it nevertheless I think it's a good distribution of responsibility.
Can we just add another word? When you look at Gandhi and his perception of the self, it almost transcends not just the physical, but even what, in Hindu terms we would phrase Atma. It actually sort of transcends that. And there is a Kannada poet who actually thinks along the same lines. I don't know if you're aware of Premji's work, but there are, I think one poem that really strikes me at this moment is when he says, it's about self and God, and how he says, everything is yours. My body, my mind, all the wealth I've created is yours. There's nothing that is mine. So this sort of dispossession, attitude that Gandhi carried, I don't know, was it before Gandhi's time? After. It's a very, interlinked thing. And so a philosophy of being a universal person and not, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not an Indian, I'm not, when I'm a Vishwamadana is what he would term it. I think it's a beautiful thing to actually study these, particular philosophies.
I know how you're using the word transcend, but in some ways it's also very immanent. It's also, everything is within the person as well. There's an intense inward dialogue rather than an outward. Somebody who is polishing up the self all the time. How can I be good? How can I do even the more difficult things with myself? How can I? So someone who is constantly. I heard this phrase about someone who is vain about his goodness. Not boastful, but vain, meaning wanting to be more and more good and making it better.
Since there's nobody else, since Chandan and Manmala are not here, I'll just take the opportunity to thank you so very much for taking the time, for giving us 2 full hours of your time. this was, I'm sure none of us have realized that it's been a fantastic session. On behalf of the Premji University, we'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.